Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our second in a series on issues revolving around the declining trust that public has in the news media, particularly the national news media. We are having a really good discussion here today. We're talking specifically today about coverage of communities of color. The Kerner Commission in 1968 talked about this following riots, and that commission concluded that there was woefully inadequate coverage of, in that case, African-American communities. Our conversation is broader than that. It's all communities of color, and over 50 years later, we're going to talk about how things have changed, have they improved enough. The first thing that I want to do is introduce you to those of us who will be participating in this discussion. I'm Rod Hicks. I am journalist on call for the Society of Professional Journalists, and I focus in particular on looking at the declining trust that the public has in the news media. I will let our guests here introduce themselves briefly. We'll start with Frances Kai-Hwa Wang.
Hi, I'm Frances Kai-Hwa Wang, and I am a freelance journalist, and I've written about Asian and Asian American communities my entire career, mostly for ethnic new media, but more recently for NBC Asian America, PRI Global Nation, Detroit Journalism Cooperative, etc. And I also teach Asian American Studies at University of Michigan, and I'm working on a book about the Vincent Chin case, which is a landmark civil rights case in the Detroit area from the 80s.
Okay, and Venise? You're still muted, Venise.
Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. My name is Venice Wagner. I'm a journalism professor at San Francisco State University. I've had many years as a professional journalist in several California cities or metropolitan cities. And I am the co-author, co-editor of the book, Reporting Inequality, Tools and Methods for Covering Race and Ethnicity.
Okay, and Katrice.
Hello, everyone. I'm Katrice Hardy. I'm the executive editor of the Indy Star and the Midwest regional editor for USA Today Network. Spent a chunk of my career before joining USA Today Network at the Virginian Pilot.
Okay, and Bryan Yenis.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bryan Yenis. I'm a national correspondent at the Fox News Channel. I have been with the same company now for 10 years out of college and since 2010. I cover a slew of issues. I'm a general assignment reporter, most recently the COVID-19 pandemic, the BLM protests, and even the Jeffrey Epstein trial. I'm excited to be here today.
Okay, a couple of things that I want to say before we dig too deep. First of all, there was a project that SPJ had planned on race that was sidelined because of the pandemic, and it covers much of the things that we will be discussing today. We really want to expose, in particular, the journalists to issues, cultural issues that they may not be aware of, to help inform their writings and their news stories when they're covering communities of color. And hopefully that's something that we can get back on track after this thing passes. I also want to just say, just in case this becomes pertinent, I am on the East Coast and there's a storm that's going up the East Coast. And if for some reason I lose my Wi-Fi or power here, I have a backup. So it may look a little different, but we are planning for that. So the first thing I want to ask is, let's just put this on the table. Where do we stand in coverage of communities of color? Anybody? What does it look like today? Katrice.
Sure, absolutely. So I think here's a great thing about what's happening today. Many more news institutions are making it a key part of their mission once again. We have a lot more focus on this effort. What's not good about today is, frankly, we haven't made a lot of progress on all the things that we pointed out years and decades ago, frankly, on this issue. But I think what's going to be great about what that's playing out across the country right now is our communities are forcing us to make true systematic changes.
Frances, from your perspective?
I think there are more there's how do I say this? There's an awareness that we need to speak to communities of color, and there are some opportunities like the NBC Asian American vertical. NBC also has a family of verticals with NBC Latino, NBC BLK, NBC Out, but there aren't very many, right? It's just a few, and it seems in a way we're siloed to talk about these issues until they blow up and they become really big. Then they get moved over to the national desk but I think it's a great opportunity. There's a lot of opportunity to write about communities of color now.
Okay, Bryan, let me get your perspective.
So I think, first and foremost, I think there was a reality check for newsrooms across the country that realized there were not enough people of color in their newsrooms, and this came to a head this year particularly. Big red alarm went off, and I know, at least for us at the Fox News Channel, it became even more important for those that were plugged in to specific communities. I'm Dominican American and Hispanic, and I have friends from multiple different types of communities of color. But what I'm saying is that it became clear that we needed people who can speak to those communities, who had sources in those communities. And I think it has really sprung some very honest conversations internally about why and how we make our newsrooms look more like the communities that we are supposed to be covering every single day. And so I know that just in the last 2 months, those conversations have been happening internally. And there's been an effort, not just in the last few months, but the last couple of years, to make that a reality. And I also think it's become clear about how important it is to have a sense of empathy when reporting on stories that affect all different types of communities. And I always say this, I think people's BS meters are very finely tuned today, and they are looking for authenticity. And I think part of that authentic storytelling comes from having people that can tell those stories in a way that really brings people to the heart of the matter. And I think a more diverse newsroom leads to that. And I think that's clear. And so, yeah, there's a bit of reckoning, and not just at Fox News Channel. I think it's all over the country and every newsroom in America.
Okay, I failed to say at the top that Bryan has an appointment just right at the top of the hour. And so he may have to leave a little early, but he's going to be here for most of the show, hopefully. Venise, one of the things that I think we need to do up front, why does this even matter? Why does it matter that people of color get covered any more than they already are?
Well, let's go back to the analysis of the Kerner Commission just for a second. One of the criticisms that they had of the media at the time was that it had been covering the Black community through a white lens. And I think that's really important for us to remember, because part of the problem that I see is that many, even though after the Kerner Commission, there were a lot of news organizations that hired Black people, and then they sort of expanded that to other people of color, Asians and Latinos. And what we saw in newsrooms is that when racial issues happened, suddenly that was the purview just of the reporters of color. And my concern is that often what happens is race is covered, but it's covered by people of color. And there are racial aspects to every single beat that everyone will cover. So what I would like people to remember is that they need to really look at their own beat, the racial issues within their own beat. And how do you do that? You start looking at the fulcrums of power, who has it, and how those fulcrums of power are being used. You ask the question of who should actually, you ask the question of what policies and practices are impacting certain communities of color. And they may impact communities of color in various ways, in different ways. So that's what you have to look at. That's what it is to look at a story through a racial lens.
Well, that said, one of the things that we also see, certainly I have seen, is that a lot of time coverage of people of color and communities of color deal with a bunch of grim statistics of things that are inflicting the community. And while I think that those things are important, I would like to see more coverage of people doing normal things. And because that's how we live our lives. Everything that goes on in our lives is not something really heavy, and it's not something that we, just dwell on all the time. So just show people living life and living a normal life. What do you think about that, Frances?
I think that's really important. And that's something that every journalist can do. I was executive director of a nonprofit for a period of time, and I had a friend who was a journalist at the Detroit Free Press, and he used to call me every time he had a story and says, "Oh, I'm looking to, do you have someone who can speak on this issue?" It had nothing to do, it wasn't specifically about race. It was just, I think he was on the business beat or something. But no matter what story he was working on, he would make sure to include, folks of color, just to get a diversity of sources. But he had to be intentional about it. And so I think that's something everyone, can easily do.
Okay, a couple of you have touched on this. If we realistically want to see more voices of people of color in mainstream news coverage, one way to do that is to hire more people of color to do the news. Now, that doesn't mean that only people of color can cover people of color, But Katrice, as an executive editor, you are the top editor in a newsroom. And how important is that in both your newspaper in Indianapolis, and since you work for Gannett, I'll just pick on Gannett. How important is it company-wide for Gannett?
I can say I joined Gannett about 4 years ago. So this is my second, major role with the company. And I've seen the commitment. I think it's really, really important to have people of color with diverse backgrounds, with diverse perspectives in charge. Frankly, the buck stops with you. If it's not happening, it's on you. And if you're not reflective of your own communities and others, that's your fault. And so I think, having those conversations, having a newsroom where it's clear that that's part of the mission, that's part of how we're going to survive. Frankly, if we don't do this, we're not going to have anybody reading us because we won't have built trust with this audience. And so, the time we have, the clock is ticking. We don't have a lot of time to go after new subscribers. Our new subscribers are frankly the subscribers we left behind a long time ago because we weren't doing this kind of work. And so I think it's critically important because honestly, the hiring decisions that are being made, the expectations for how hiring works, how you set a culture in a newsroom for inclusiveness, all those things play into coverage, hiring, retention, people feeling as if they can rise above and do great work. That it's critical to do so.
Okay, I do want to encourage people who are viewing us, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. We do have a couple already that I will get to in a moment, but I just want to see if Bryan had anything that he wanted to add to that discussion.
Look, I think, I'm not part of the hiring process, but I can tell you that frequently what I always hear is, and I know that many of us who've gone through internships, the barrier of entry to get into these companies has always been really steep. And I know that at least through Fox, I was one of the fortunate ones to have gone through an apprentice program and kind of was given access to leaders within the companies, so that as part of a program in which they made sure that those from diverse backgrounds didn't just leave the newsroom once they were there for 2 or 3 months. This has always been something where, especially in television, it's all about who you know. So I do think that those types of structures and those types of programs are beneficial on evidence of that. But I do think on the ground there are things as a reporter that we just can do day in and day out that can better inform our viewers and also hit on this issue of diversity and finding authentic voices. I think in sourcing, no doubt about it. I know Francis brought that up. Plenty of people that you decide, you're the gatekeeper as to who you decide to interview and speak to. And I know, frankly, in terms of deadlines, it just can be anybody who you can get sometimes. But I think with a more conscious thought of it about doing that, I think that's very helpful. I also think in the stories that we pitch, how can we continue to really pitch them and really stand behind them? And I think that starts with the reporter being thoughtful about pitching those types of stories. And I also think just even on the ground in breaking news situations, if I was, for instance, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we spoke about, I did a report about how it disproportionately affects Hispanic and Black communities, and to find people that can speak to that, but also unemployment and how, obviously how that can affect that. But I think outside of the pandemic with the BLM protest, if I'm in the middle of a protest, it's making a simple decision about who you are going to choose to highlight in that protest. Is the person that I'm speaking to, for instance, is it the one white person in the entire crowd? I mean, maybe that's newsworthy in that sense because it is the only white person in the entire crowd. But for me, it's about choosing the people on the ground who are more representative of the story that's happening in front of you, and choosing the people to speak to you live on the ground that you think are representative of the truest form of what's happening. I think even in making those decisions, those split-second decisions are really important in this live TV environment. I was able to mediate a conversation, for instance, with Sean Hannity. I'm a reporter at Fox. I stick to the news. I don't control what shows I go on, but when a show comes to me that is opinion, I can control the kind of conversation I can have on the street. And to mediate a conversation with people, and in this case, protesters, on a show in which most people would think that conversation would not go very well, was an important example of why it was so important to have people on the ground that are diverse, empathetic to understanding the different issues at stake, and choosing the right people to speak to the moment.
There is another side to this that you just touched on, Bryan, and that is getting people in the communities to open up. Because over the decades, journalists have not necessarily instilled a lot of trust in people of color and communities of color. And so what is the way that we can even get into the communities and say, hey, trust us, we're going to do it right this time? How do we get people to open up and to understand how important it is to have their stories told or to have their voices in the story? You want to speak to that, Venise?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I'd love to speak to that because, I find that many reporters are sort of afraid of even going up to people of color. That's a problem. And how you resolve that is by you begin spending time in those communities. You begin making relationships. Even if there isn't a story, for example, sometimes you just go out there to a particular community and just get to know people and talk to people. That's how you begin creating relationships and creating sources. Go to a beauty parlor, go to a cafe, strike up conversations with folks, but you have to really go there. You can't parachute in every time something happens, something bad happens, and expect people to talk to you.
I do want to point out, and I'm sure that our students who are tuned in have heard this before, but what you just said is really an important aspect of journalism, period. And that is building sources. The thing that you want to do is just have your sources diverse, though. You don't want to just rely on, the people who you go to all the time, and particularly if they are not people of color. You have to diversify your source list, and you have to build relationships. Francis, did you want to add to this?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways you can do that. I mean, again, like what Venise said, don't be there for just the bad news. You have to be there for the good news too. So there's all sorts of cultural, like I live in a small town. We have a lot of cultural festivals and festivities like Lunar New Year. There's Chinese New Year, there's Vietnamese New Year's, there's Thai New Year. There's all sorts of New Year's events. And when you go, if you cover these, like I want to say feel good events, people are happy to see their picture in the paper, and it builds a relationship. Now, next time they know who you are, and they kind of know how to deal with you, and you know how to, what is going on in the community. And I want to say the more you cover, you try to extend your own experience so that you learn more about other communities, and that you discover the stories. And when you know the story, when you know the community, you can learn more stories.
Venise, you had mentioned that people going into communities of, well, what you said was that you have to not be afraid to go up and speak to people who look different than you. This goes the same, I imagine, for journalists of color. So as a journalist of color, it's also incumbent on you to speak to diverse sources as well, right? And also to go beyond your own community.
Absolutely. I remember when I was covering, I was assigned to cover one festival. I can't remember what the festival was, but it was in Chinatown. And I hadn't really spent a lot of time in Chinatown. And as a woman of color, as a Black woman, sometimes you feel very self-conscious. And I really kind of had a hard time getting people to talk to me. And then I got sort of a hang of what I needed to do to connect with people there.
Right.
So, you just have to make a habit of going to lots of different kinds of communities to cover any kind of story. If you have to do a story about, for example, the high price or the rising price of gasoline, most people just go to gas stations and, talk to the people who are at the pump. And sometimes you might get a diverse group of people, and sometimes you might not. So you have to make an effort. You have to make an effort and be intentional, like someone previously said, and go out to other communities and ask those kinds of questions.
Many times when I was a reporter, I went to cover stories where every potential source, if I was covering an event, everybody there was white. And so that's something that you have to think about too. You cannot, again, you just have to go in and talk to people and not be worried what their perception is about you, I guess. Katrice, you have any advice for people of color who are going into situations where it's all white, particularly if they're young and may not have done anything like that before?
Absolutely. I've been there for many, many, many years. And I think the most important thing is the same skill set you use to interview anyone is the same skill set you use to do an interview in that situation. Walk up, say who you are, what your purpose is, and that you really want to get a good story and you want to talk to as many people as possible about, their perspective about why they're there, what that event is on. It's interesting because I think we have struggled with that sometimes, but other reporters, frankly, people of color don't have to. And so on the flip side, when you talk about people that aren't of color who are going in situations where it's mostly people of color, it's the same thing. Be intentional, be focused, have a mission around building trust in those communities. It's all the same thing, stating who you are, telling people, look, this is the first time I've been to an event like this, but I'm looking forward to understanding what's happening, owning up to that. I think people find that to be very authentic and trusting, and that kind of actually helps you with your own, consciousness about the issue.
Katrice, stay with me for a moment. I'm going to read to you one of the questions from one of our viewers.
Okay.
It says, as a Black journalist, how do you separate your feelings from difficult news topics of race relations, such as anger or sadness about police brutality and Black Lives Matter?
Interesting question, and one that I've definitely wrestled with quite a bit. I can tell you when a lot of the protests broke out, you know, the pain that I personally felt having to lead a newsroom covering those efforts, but also experiencing some of those things from time to time in different situations, me, myself, family members. It's difficult, you know, down to whether I could buy my daughter a Black Lives Matters t-shirt because I'm a journalist. So all of those things, you know, I've really wrestled and struggled with that. I think really the bottom line is staying focused on your mission, owning the fact of, you know, I'm going through this. And I told my staff, I told them, you know, hey, I'm feeling a lot of pain. There's a lot of emotions around what we're covering, but we can't lose sight of why we're doing it and what we're doing. And I think we should have those conversations so that we have true, authentic coverage around that. And so I would say, you know, call your colleagues. I've done a lot of that. You know, some of us right now, everything's through Zoom, right? We live on Zoom, but having those conversations offline, scheduling those times to have, you know, active conversation about it, it's been very, very helpful. And then just trading tips with each other. You know, when this happened, how did you feel? Or how did you handle this? It's critically important that we network and we use those networks to do so. And so for students, reaching out to professors, reaching out to working journalists, just other students about how you're handling that, I think is the best advice I could give you.
Okay, Francis, in the early stages of the coronavirus, there were comments made that were deemed racist. And in fact, the Asian American Association, I'm screwing it up, but the Asian Journalists Organization did put out a statement about language. Is that something you can address?
Sure. There's a direct correlation in the use of racist language and the rise in hate crimes. And I think it's Stop AAPI Hate has been tracking all of these, and so you can get all the data there. But I think it was clearly a phenomenon that was happening not just across the country but around the world, and it affected businesses as well as individuals, and a wide variety of individuals, right, from 2-year-olds to 92-year-old grandpas. And it was just astonishing how many, well, actually, I shouldn't say that. It wasn't astonishing. It was terrible, but it was. There were so many hate crimes, and so what did AAJ say? They put out. They said, be careful about how you use your language. And I think there is, you know, some study to be done, not just in this. Oh, and then also like the CAPAC, the Council of Asian Pacific, no, Congressional Asian Pacific Americans, something, Representative Judy Chu and company, they put out a statement to say, you know, that the leadership of their country shouldn't use this sort of language, because every time, you know, some of this racist language, this racist imagery gets used, there's another hate crime attack. And a lot of people, there have been a lot of really interesting stories talking about the history of how this isn't a new thing. And the WHO recommends don't use specific ethnicities and countries to originate with viruses and such. So, and I've lost my train of thought.
That's fine.
And so, give me another question. How do I wrap this up?
No, the thing that I want to do is I want to move to a couple other people to talk about language. Venise, and then Bryan.
Okay. Can I just say one more thing about language? Here is really obvious, right, and explicit. But I think language is important in other ways, and people should take some time to understand why communities are insisting on using language in a particular way. For example, AP finally came out and said Asian American should not have the hyphen. Why? Why? It's not, if people say, but it's grammar, you should have hyphen. It's not about the hyphen, right? Asian American without the hyphen means Asian is an adjective describing American. So it's a statement saying these people are American, happen to be Asian. They could be ugly Americans or they could be beautiful Americans. Here, in this case, they're Asian Americans. And so this is all embedded in the language and you wouldn't necessarily know unless you take some time to study. And I think there are a lot of terms that communities use that would behoove taking some time to learn that.
Okay, Venise?
I think language is certainly important, and one area you might want to think about is racial identification. When is it appropriate to identify people by race? And in some instances, you don't need to, unless the story has some racial component to it. So I think that's one thing to remember in terms of language. Not all stories need racial identifications. And if you're going to have racial identifications, then they need to be applied equally. In other words, you don't just identify a person of color and not identify the white person. You have to, you know, identify everybody equally, but it has to be relevant to the story.
Okay, and Bryan, did you want to say anything on language?
Yeah, I think it started for me in my career when I started at FoxNewsLatino.com, which used to be sort of like what Francis has talked about with NBC Latino and all these like siloed websites. The big conversation about the use of undocumented versus illegal immigrants, and that's something in which I have, ever since college, have always stuck to undocumented. I think that is just an important distinction to make. And I also am very mindful of the language I use given the network that I'm on. I think there are things that are said by some of our opinion hosts that actually give the responsibility for me and for other people that are in the news division to make sure that we're right, that we're even more right than other people. And so there is a real weight of responsibility to make sure that we are very precise with the language in the news division. And I think particularly when I was out there for the BLM protests, making sure that when I was describing rioting happening, that I was not describing peaceful protesters as rioters, or that if there was looting happening, that I wasn't saying here are protesters looting. No, these are specifically looters. They are not the same peaceful protesters that I saw just a few moments ago with context and perspective. I think particularly in that story and the fact that we were live nonstop for weeks on end covering that, I thought was incredibly important to get that particular language right as a reporter on the ground. Because, you know, in the world we're living in right now, things are going to be shifted and used and for whatever political means are going to be used for. So, you know, that, you know, an extra, and I'm not just going to say that if there's an extra weight of responsibility to just have Fox. I think given the opinion world that we're living in right now with all of the cable broadcasting, I think all of us in the news divisions across all the cable networks are dealing with an extra level of weight on us, given the fact that our opinion programming is in prime time and is usually what is seen more, is our most watched programming of the day.
I want to go to a question that was submitted. Let me just reiterate that if you have a question for the panel, please put it in the Q&A. There's a tab at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. But this question, it says that there are a lot of people who get ignored because they're not Black, as if they couldn't possibly have a story. So their stories don't seem to matter to anyone. I want to be the journalist that covers everything and everyone and not leave anyone out based on their skin color or other reasons. Anyone has a response to that? Is that a legitimate argument?
I'll say something.
Yeah.
So I think what we have to remember is indeed that should be our charge. We need to get voices of everyone. But I think what the history has shown is that voices of people of color have not been covered accurately. They've been misrepresented often, or they've been ignored, completely invisible. And so I think what we're talking about here is not covering one group over another. It's being inclusive, and inclusivity means that you are including everyone's voice into your stories. So I think that's what we have to remember here. It's not necessarily pitting one group against another group. And let me just add, I think there's another issue that we need to consider too, is that often when people are thinking people of color, they're thinking Black people. This is not a Black-white issue. We are so beyond just Black-white issues anymore. This is a multiracial, multicultural world that we live in here in the United States, and we need to be thinking about the different perspectives of stories. So when I initially talked about racial lenses, I didn't mean to imply that it was just a Black lens we need to look through. We need to look through various racial lenses when we're looking at stories.
And I can't echo what Venise said more than eloquently, because a couple things. I mean, we used to do a lot of newsroom audits when we audited who we were talking to. And time again, those audits came back with results of we're talking to mostly white people, and many people of color, people of many different races and ethnic backgrounds weren't represented. I mean, we can go back decades and that's the case. I can speak from personal experience. Anytime, for whatever reason, when we were really just focused on print, and we would have 3 stories about people of color on the front page, I can't tell you how many phone calls I would get or emails about the fact that I had become the Black paper that day, and what happened. And so for that to be a comment that people still make, and that was very recently, shows the fact that we had not been covering many people of color, and most of our content had been revolving around, whites and others, people of power, who traditionally are of power.
Right. Another question from our viewers. What are some examples?
Rod, can I just add one other thing to that?
Sure.
Because I think class is also important here. We haven't talked anything about class, and it's such an important thing to keep in mind when you're talking to people. So when you just mentioned, Katrice, about covering white people, but they tended to be white people in power. So are we getting the voices of white people who don't have power, right? I think all this is what I mean by inclusivity. We need to include all of these kinds of voices.
Okay, very good point. The question from the audience, what are examples of stories where racial identification is needed?
Since I brought up the issue, I guess I better respond. I think when race is an issue, for example, I was reading just a very beautiful story about a couple in New York they're not in New York, they're in Minnesota, but it ran in the New York Times, and they met and they decided to get married. And they talked about the Loving case, which is an old 1960s case out of Virginia that actually allowed interracial marriage. And so in the story, they were talking about how they were honoring this case. Well, it didn't make sense to me until they mentioned the race of the couple. One was Black and one was white. And so that's an instance where it makes sense that you would include the racial identification of the couple. I'm sorry, go ahead.
When you're pointing out disparities or inequities, I think, yes, with the recent COVID-19 coverage, all the research that information we finally were able to get a hold of how COVID-19 has, disproportionately affected certain groups of color, that was a story where race mattered.
Right.
It's a story when you're writing about criminal justice issues and you're reviewing, for instance, this project we did in South Carolina when I oversaw that news organization on civil asset forfeiture. And police were far more stopping Black males of color in particular of a certain age group and taking their possessions and not charging them with a thing. That age group was disproportionately targeted more than any other. So I think race matters, of course, in those situations.
Okay. Francis or Bryan, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think sometimes race also matters when you're pushing against stereotypes. If with, like, for example, the undocumented conversation, there are a huge population of Asian Americans who are undocumented. So but they get forgotten because of the stereotype of who is undocumented. And same with the Black Lives Matters protests. There were all sorts of Asian Americans also involved. You know, they had different protests and actions and great stories, actually. And so as much as you can get, I personally like to find the stories that connects the different races. You know, the people are doing interesting things across racial and ethnic lines. And those are amazing, fun, interesting stories.
I have a just a quick ad. I echo everything that you guys all brilliantly said, but also I covered the Ricky Renuncia protests in Puerto Rico, and in that sense, it was really important that I continued to echo that these were Puerto Ricans who were on U.S. territory, and they were Americans, because there was this frequent conversation as to why should we care about what's happening on that island. You know, and so that in that particular sense, it was really important to get that identifier right and to help remind the viewer over and over again that we weren't just talking about Latino Americans, we're talking about Puerto Ricans who weren't on an island that's foreign to us. And this is why they're considered, just like everybody else, American. And so in talking about that story, that was just really important to get that right as well.
Okay. One of the questions that we have: as editor of a majority white newsroom at an incredibly diverse university, with ever fewer senior staff members of color, how can we encourage a culture of inclusiveness and solid coverage of Black, Indigenous, people of color without being tone deaf, making missteps, or alienating the few in our newsroom? How can we cover them without being or appearing to be tone deaf? I'm sorry.
I think you have to immerse, I'm going to go back to the same thing I started with, immerse yourself in these communities. Go into these communities knowledgeable. That means you're going to have to read books, you're going to have to read ethnic newspapers, you're just going to have to school yourself. So you don't want to go in completely ignorant of what these communities are facing, what their experiences are. And then, like I said before, also go into these communities and introduce yourself, get to know people, talk to people. This is how you begin learning about cultural communities.
Could there also be tone deaf stories?
Absolutely, but I think you avoid those tone deaf stories by getting to know people and learning and talking. So in other words, there's a bit of humility that you have to have when you're approaching these stories. You can't assume that you know, you can't assume that you have all the answers. You can't even assume that all the things that you know apply to the community that you're covering. So you have to go in with humility. Try to develop a relationship with someone who knows a lot about the community and about its culture. They can serve as your liaison. They can serve as your expert who can educate you about things. So it takes a lot more effort than just going there. You have to be intentional about how you're learning about communities. And I'm sure other panelists may have some other suggestions.
Are there other suggestions?
Yeah, I would also say that it's really important, frankly, to do this work when you don't have a story per se that you're working on. Because the last thing you want to do is have anybody who you don't have a good relationship with, especially a whole community of people, say, oh, well, I only hear from so-and-so when they're writing about something. The same skills that we use to, get good sources covering government, that's a lot of work where we just show up and we sit and we are part of an event. We're just observing and we're talking to as many people as possible, working in coffee shops. But beyond that, just say, I want to get to know you. And that's not necessarily for a story. And I want to also get to know you too. And not just even going through one person, but multiple people. So you're building up that trust. I think that's where you're going to see true inclusiveness.
Do you believe if we have more journalists of color, it will change the whole representation of how we tell a story? Like where I'm from, people of color are represented negatively in the news. which can have an effect with trust?
So I'm sorry to jump in, but I have very strong feelings about this. So I think it depends, right? Having a diverse staff does not necessarily mean that you're going to get good representative stories unless there is buy-in at the top. The top has to listen to listen to its staff, listen to these different reporters of color, and hear what they're actually telling you. There were too many times in my own experience when I explained a possible story to an editor and they just looked at me blankly like, that's not a story. And so I think there has to be some buy-in at the top. It's not just a matter of hiring lots of reporters of color. It's also getting some of those people in management positions and supervisory positions, but it's also a matter of editors listening to what reporters are telling them.
Bryan, I don't know if you're going to have to cut out, but is there anything that you want to catch us up on, or any viewpoints you want to share?
I can stay all the way till 3 o'clock, but I'll just add on that I do believe that there needs to, it does all start at the top. We can pitch every single day all we want as reporters, but at the end of the day, if the top leadership does not believe that story is important, it becomes very difficult.
Okay, I'm sorry, let me just interrupt. We're talking to students here who are about to start their careers, and they are not at the top, and they get to a newsroom and they have all these ideas and they want to do everything that you guys are saying, and they get into a newsroom, and as you say, it starts at the top and then it's not starting. What do? You just give up?
No, you continue to pitch. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, at the end of the day, you have to convince, the stories that you bring to the table every single morning need to be the stories that you think are important. And you have to fight that battle day in and day out. It will continue to be a grind every single day that you're out there once you have the job. And I think once you realize, if you work in an environment that's listening to everybody in the newsroom, and you start finding allies in the newsroom that also believe and can be champions of you and your work, that is how you're able to not only elevate yourself, but you're able to elevate those stories as well. But you cannot go into these newsrooms and remain silent. I don't care if it's your first month or your first couple of days. I think you really need to go in and really feel empowered as a journalist about your role and the responsibility you have. I mean, a lot of people talk about, you cover all of these horrible things day in and day out. Doesn't that weigh on you? And I say, no, I mean, not necessarily, because I feel as though I'm actually contributing and doing something. And I feel like everybody who takes this job, and once you take a job outside of college, I think that's a really good mindset, to be empowered by the power that you have in this role, and to go into newsrooms and to spark these conversations. And the more of you that there are, the more likely that there will be significant change. So yeah, I think, it is imperative for all of us that once you are in those newsrooms, that you do everything you can to have these authentic conversations, and that you pitch.
Let me just tell you, just one moment, Venise. Everything that you're saying, Bryan, I agree with. But there's a reality, and that is when you are just starting out and you go into a newsroom and you're trying to push management to do something that they don't want to do, you can get labeled as a troublemaker pretty quickly. And that's not going to be necessarily good for your career. I just can imagine, and I know people who've done this. They've tried to push on issues, not just limited to coverage of people of color, but pushing other issues, topics, or whatever, and they get marginalized because management just gets tired of hearing it. That's just the reality that people are faced, and we're telling these young people to go out and do that. But we do have to recognize that it could leave them very frustrated. I don't know this person, I read a story about one young woman who left a newsroom, left this industry because she was just frustrated that she kept trying to push company to do what she very strongly felt was right, and they wouldn't do it, and that she was marginalized because of it. I'm going to go to Katrice just briefly because she is a top manager here. She runs a newspaper. But so when you get people who are doing this, maybe not you, I mean, you're saying all the right things, and I trust that you are the type of editor that I would want to work for. But surely throughout your career, you've run into what I just described.
Yes. Absolutely. A couple things. I do want to give this good example of how, like, frankly, the culture matters. Who's in charge does matter. We have an intern this summer who came to us from Texas. She's a rising senior. And maybe a month into the job, she's covering one of the protests on a weekend. And she was asked by an editor, the weekend editor, hey, was that, you didn't put he or she next to the person you quoted. Is it a he or she? And she said, well, I didn't ask. And so I don't feel comfortable stating whether it's a he or she. And he, frankly, that conversation probably didn't go the way that intern wanted to. And so the next day I happened to be having a follow-up. I kind of do a session with each intern midway through their internship about how things are going. And she shared this with me. And I thought, wow, I'm so glad you brought this up. Probably the conversation you had with that particular person didn't go as well as it should, but frankly, this is something we should bring to our diversity committee. So a couple things. We do have a diversity committee in Indy that started long before I got there, and they are a great resource. So if your newsroom doesn't have one, your company might have one. So that's a great outlet for issues like this to be discussed. Frankly, I also think, bonding among other colleagues again. So, do you have a college professor you can call and talk to about how to approach this? Do you have a mentor out there who you can call and talk to? One of the roles, the other hats I wear is I'm the diversity chair for the News Leaders Association. And so we have been doing this survey every year. It used to be ASNE, right? On diversity census of our industry. And one of the things we found was a number of people, just like that young lady you read about, Rod, were like, I left the industry because I'm tired of being the only one. I'm tired of speaking out. Culture matters. And so we're revamping that survey and looking and having a kind of a focus group around that and what we can do as part of that survey work to improve culture. So I do think it's an obstacle. I face it. I've said things or frankly been reluctant to say things out of fear or concern about how I might be perceived. So, using outlets like this, reaching out to people like me and Rod and others as you go across your career, you're going to have that support and get some advice about how to manage those tough situations.
Venise, I'm sorry that I steered away from you for so long, but go ahead.
No, Katrice put it beautifully. I would just add one other thing is, when you're in the newsroom, you should be building relationships with allies. That is, people who can have your back, and people who might have a little bit more clout than you. So always sort of develop those kinds of relationships. They can help you in the end.
Okay. There's one other question. We're close up, but I do want to get this this question in, and it's probably going to be the last one we can address. But it says, earlier this summer, the director of journalism, the director of our journalism school left amid accusations of racism. As the white editor of our newspaper, how can I create an environment where journalists of color feel welcome and heard when they have often felt isolated by the faculty, advisors, and overall environment of our institutions? The thing here is, when you are in the newsroom and you are a person of color, who do you turn to? Who wants to address this? Francis?
I'm a freelancer. I've never actually been in a newsroom. But I would say find allies, people who can, build relationships in the good times, so that when the bad, when crisis hits, you have a support and you're ready, and people know who you are by then. Okay.
Venise, you work for the San Francisco Chronicle, right?
So can you rephrase the question? Because I think I got a little lost in it.
Okay. How can I create an environment where journalists of color feel welcome and heard?
So this is a student editor who wants to create an environment, a culturally inclusive environment, right?
Editor of their newspapers, it says.
So I think one thing I would recommend is have a sit down, have a little round table with everyone, and make sure that journalists of color in your staff have voices, and just talk through some of this stuff. What is it that they would want to make them feel like they're heard, or like, you know, their issues are important? That's one thing I would recommend.
All right, Bryan, have you felt this feeling of isolation that's referenced in this note?
Yeah, I mean,
It may have to do with personality too. Some of us are more extroverted, and
yeah, no, I think
and I say that as an introvert.
I think we all look. The isolation feeling is this level of responsibility and weight that you have to get it right. I mean, when you look around the room and you realize, you know, that there are diverse voices, but I feel a responsibility, and there are mechanisms to use the mechanisms within the company to make sure that we are having these conversations. So we have a diversity council at Fox. I'm a vocal member of the diversity council. There are conversations that are happening, that continue to happen, that are honest about mistakes, about things in which we need to get better at. And to the credit of management where I work, there's a conversation that's happening. I think the next step at all of these newsrooms, and I think for this editor, this white editor at the college paper, is that you can have all these conversations you want. At the end of the day, you better follow it up with some sort of action, because at the end of the day, you know, that needs to also be communicated, because if you're just listening and not doing anything, then you run into all other sorts of problems. So I think if you're going to have the mechanism to have a conversation, I think you also need to set the expectations as to what the next follow-through steps can happen at your company. And I think that there is a lot of us in newsrooms and big corporations and some companies like Fox that, you know, there are so many battles that you're going to fight within your own career, but also once you get to a place when you've risen up and you finally are in that place, you also have a responsibility to make that place better for other people who are just coming out in college and opening doors for other people of color or otherwise. And I think that after 10 years is where I'm at in my career, where I felt like I had to do what I had to do before I could do what I want to do in many respects. I think that goes back to the idea of being that person when you come out of college and just, you know, light the place on fire and do all those things. It's true. You do have to sort of grind and prove that you can do the work and build allies. And over time, this isn't a process that's going to happen overnight. It is a nonstop process, I think, that'll continue for the rest of our careers, for the rest of my life. I do not think that we're just going to, 2021 is going to happen and all newsrooms are going to be perfect. This is going to continuously be a battle for all of our careers, especially those who are just starting out.
Okay, the questions are getting better and better, but unfortunately we're almost out of time. There's just one question that I want to read, and I'm only going to call on one person to address it given the time. How can students manage boundaries of not wanting to do certain race-based stories because management wants them to use their cultural connections to cover the story? And what's the emotional toll of constantly having to navigate that? Our last question, who wants to address that? Katrice.
I knew you were going to call on me. You know, obviously I've been there as well when I was still reporting. And sometimes, frankly, as an editor, it's interesting sometimes the things that the colleagues will reach out to you about. It's always kind of the same topic, and you start to that starts to weigh on you. A couple of things that I would say about that is be honest and upfront about it. Say, hey, I am happy to help out. I recognize that I represent this perspective, but I think it's really important for us to have other journalists, some who don't look like me, you know, cover these issues, because this is taking a toll on me. And frankly, to have an inclusive, true newsroom that represents our community, everybody needs to be able to go into these situations and cover them. I'm happy to, you know, help you, connect you to some places where they might go, but I need to take a break from that, just based on everything that's going on. And I think that is a fair statement. I think that you know, your editor, whoever you're speaking to should be open-minded about that and understand that. Because it can't be just the same person writes the same kinds of stories all the time, because frankly, that lens will be a part of those stories, all those stories, and we need different perspectives around those issues.
Well, we're going to have to wrap up. And so thank you. I'm sorry that we can't keep this going. And I really apologize for not being able to get to all these really good questions. I do want to remind everybody that this is a series, and next week, on next Tuesday, we're going to delve into bias and opinion in reporting, which is a common accusations of people who say that they don't trust the media. I also want to point out that at the end of the month in our last sessions on how journalists can rebuild trust, it's a broader look of the topic that we have today, that we will have on that panel a woman who is a Native American, and she could not make this panel because of her schedule, but she will be on that panel. And I expect for her to, in that session, append some of the things that were said today. But sorry we have to go, but thank you so much. And I look forward to talking to each of you more, having you participate in SPJ events more. And I also thank everybody who tuned in and watched us today. Thank you.